Jeg beder undskylde, men jeg håber, man vil forstå, at vi føler os ret uskyldige i både sagens anledning og dens forløb.
Vi anmoder endnu en gang politiet om at fjerne sig fra universitetets grund.
So I'm going to be talking to you guys today about South Africa's Fees Must Fall protest movement. So the Fees Must Fall protests were a set of protests in South Africa that happened in 2015 and 2016 around issues of rising higher education costs and with the demands for free higher education for South African students. The protests at their peak were the largest protests in South Africa since the end of apartheid, and they culminated earlier this year with a concession from the state to fund free higher education for 90% of South African households. So there's potentially a lot to cover. I'm going to try and keep it relatively short and succinct, but I'm going to walk you through how we got to a point in 2015 where hundreds of thousands of students across South Africa were protesting. I'll talk you through what actually happened, so what the protests were, where they happened, when they happened, and then at the end I'll talk a little bit about how we actually organized them and a bit of the organizational structure in the protests. Cool, so let's get cracking. So, how did we get to a point in 2015 where hundreds of thousands of students were protesting? And the answer to that is there were a series of long-term trends that led us to a kind of breaking point. So, after 1994, South Africa went through a democratic transition after the end of apartheid. That involved a whole bunch of societal changes, but some quite significant ones happened in higher education. So between the year 2000 and the year 2015, the number of students in the higher education system effectively doubled. Now that was a dividend of democracy. The vast majority of that increase in the number of students were black African, South African students who had been systemically excluded from higher education during apartheid. But while that outcome was an incredibly positive one, an incredibly important one, it wasn't mirrored by an equivalent increase in state funding for higher education. So the size of the education system doubled, the amount of funding didn't even come close to keeping up. So in real terms, what did that mean? In 2000, the state funded almost exactly half of the cost of the higher education system, 50%. By the year 2015, that had dropped down to 38%. Now, that was quite a significant gap. To their credit, universities managed to make up a little bit of the gap with an increase in funding from the private sector, but the vast majority of that gap was made up with increases in tuition fees for students. So throughout the 2000s, you had a steady increase in tuition fees paid by students, and that trend accelerated after the 2008 financial crisis, with very significant tuition fee increases in the early 2010s. Okay, cool. So those were the kind of broad trends, but of course the protests happened in 2015, and they didn't come out of nowhere in 2015. There's a reason they happened in 2015 and not 2005 or 2025. That's what I'm going to talk about now. So what was it about 2015 in particular that led us to a point where you had these massive student protests? And there are several reasons, and I'll walk you through the main ones. So throughout this talk, I'm going to be concentrating a little bit on what happened specifically at my university. That's partly because my university is where the protests started in both of the years, and it played a particularly important role. But at my institution, in the year 2015, a particularly brave and organized Student Representative Council was elected for that year. That would play a significant part throughout the protests, and I'll point that out as I talk a bit more about what happened. But there were some particular sparking points that happened through the year. So I understand that in Denmark you have kind of a free education system. Different countries have different ways of funding students that can't necessarily afford education right off the bat. So in the States there's kind of a private student loan system. The UK is also based on student loans. Somewhere like Belgium is kind of a mixed system with bursaries and sort of state funding. South Africa had something called the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, which was a state-run student loan program. Unfortunately, in the beginning of 2015, there was a huge both funding and administrative crisis at the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, which left tens of thousands of students around the country without funding midway through their degrees. So my institution was particularly hard hit. Almost 3,000 students were discovered at the beginning of the academic year that they no longer had funding to complete their studies. There was 30,000 people at my institution, so 3,000 students is almost 10% of the students at my institution. So that was a massive crisis. Again, that brave organized Student Representative Council mobilized around the issue and organized a fundraising campaign to try to fund as many students as they can. They managed to raise in excess of 4 million rand to fund students. Unfortunately, that only amounted to allowing 100 students to be able to continue their studies. But what it did do was really politicize the campus around the issue of fees. Through that year, another trend that became important was you had a process of attempts to organize students and workers in partnership around the issue of outsourcing, also academics as well. So outsourcing is where instead of the institution directly hiring its own workers, so cleaning staff, gardeners, etc., they hire firms that then hire workers. That means that the university is then not responsible for the benefits and for example, pay of the workers who are working at the university, and it led to quite significant levels of exploitation. So there was a process of organization between students, workers, and academics through the year, and then the kind of really important spark points happened in sort of October 2015. So then you had this context of a highly politicized campus around the issue of fees, a very organized representative council, and increasing levels of organization between students, workers, and academics. What then sparked this to lead to significant protests were two things. So the university announced a 10.5% tuition fee increase, which even by the standards of the increases in the previous years was very significant. And of course, usually they'd been around 8 or 9% in the previous couple of years, but going above 10% for the first time was a big psychological gap. At the same time, the way it works in South Africa is you've got kind of your tuition fees, but you have to pay an amount upfront. The upfront fee payment rose at my institution above 10,000 Rand for the first time. And again, you had a psychological barrier. And so a lot of students, particularly after the things that had happened at the beginning of the year, were suddenly faced with the fact that they might not be able to continue their studies the next year. So you had increasing organization on a couple of levels, politicization, and then you had these spark points. So what happened? We had a shutdown. So the Wit Student Representative Council began organizing and mobilizing around the issue with the idea of having a big protest march on October 14th, 2015, which was a Wednesday. As that date grew closer, they sort of mobilized and organized for sort of 3 or 4 days. As that date grew closer, the idea of the protest began to be a little bit more radical. And on the morning of October 14th, instead of kind of beginning the march, the Student Representative Council mobilized students and began blockading entrances to the university. So initially, they were pretty successful. They kind of blocked traffic, stopped academics and students from entering the institution. They were quite quickly beaten off by private security. By that point, more students had sort of joined the protest. Some of those students then went to the big administrative building at the institution, which is sort of a tall building, which you could only access the kind of administrative floors through stairwells and lifts. They then blocked the stairwells and lifts that administrative staff couldn't exit or enter the building. More students then went and tried to disrupt lectures and other academic activities, tests, exams, laboratories, and lectures. And as more people began to join the protests, they then went and blockaded the entrances again, and this time much more successfully. What happened next? Well, the institution sent out an email to all academic staff and students in the afternoon saying that the academic program for the day had been cancelled because of the disruptions. So that was the first day. There were then kind of more negotiations between the Student Representative Council and the administration. That didn't come to anything, so the protest continued the next day. It was shut down for a second day. No more progress was made that evening between students and the administration. So the protest continued, and the university was shut down for a third day. So it started on a Wednesday. By that point, we were at Friday. So we'd been shut down for 3 days at that point. We'd gotten pretty good at shutting down the university. So that was the beginning. At this point, the protest had kind of been confined to my institution, which is the University of the Witwatersrand, which is one of the kind of big 3 elite institutions in South Africa. As a consequence, it had been getting a very significant amount of coverage in media, and had kind of begun to spark a bit of a national conversation around fees. During those 3 days, the demands of the protests had kind of coalesced around a demand for an end to the fee increase for that year. That then there were also murmurings in the background about demands for free education, but again, it was still based at the institution, so those hadn't become the main demands, and a demand for sort of insourcing of workers, so fighting against the outsourcing of workers. But like I said, there'd been significant media coverage, and it had just hit the weekend, and we didn't have a university to shut down over the weekend. So what did we do? Well, students started mobilizing on social media. So there was a huge effort to sort of pump out material, make sure students' voices were being heard over the weekend. I headed up the media task team, which essentially pumped out opinion editorials and organized interviews to make sure that there was a continuation of students' voices in the media over the weekend. And this began to spark a kind of national conversation around fees. Over the weekend, the discussion really started getting going on other campuses. Students around the country started talking about fees. These significant fee increases were happening everywhere. And by the end of the weekend, it had kind of become properly a national conversation. Unfortunately, we hadn't made any progress with our university administration the next day. The protest continued. University was shut down on the Monday as well. But this time it wasn't just us, because the University of Cape Town also shut down, as well as a couple of other institutions. By Wednesday, almost every higher education institution, or every public university in South Africa, was shut down. There are 26 public universities in South Africa. I think 23 or 24 of them were shut down by the Wednesday. So we went from sort of a big protest at one institution. It had now become a national movement with students organizing at institutions across the country. And the demands had now properly solidified around an end to the tuition fee increases and a strong demand for free education. So what happened next? Well, students were protesting at their universities, but higher education institutions were holding pretty firm and saying essentially, we can't end the tuition fee increases. This is an issue of state funding. Now, there was an extent to which they probably could have reached into their pockets a bit, but the truth was we did have a real kind of state funding crisis in South Africa. So first 3 days was at my institution, second 3 days was kind of national protests on university campuses. From then on, students went to the streets. So on Wednesday, October 21st, exactly a week after the protest had started at our institution, students at the University of Cape Town, several thousand of them, marched on National Parliament in Cape Town. They were beaten off by police, they were shot at with rubber bullets and with stun grenades, and this is tear gas you can see in the background there. Next day in Johannesburg, my institution in partnership with one or two other institutions marched on Luthuli House, which is the headquarters of the South African ruling party, the African National Congress. Again, demanding free education. Several thousand students again marched through kind of central Johannesburg, which is the big city in South Africa. And then we hit the kind of climax, which is on October 23rd, which is the Friday. 10,000 students from institutions around Gauteng, which is the most populous province in South Africa, marched on the Union Buildings, which is the seat of the executive government in South Africa. It's the equivalent of like the White House in South Africa. The 10,000 students marched there, camped outside the buildings all day, demanding a response from the president of the country. And we didn't get one, and we didn't get one, and we didn't get one, and then late in the day, we got one. And the president announced that the state would be funding a 0% fee increase for the year 2016, and that they would be instituting a commission of inquiry into higher education and training. So we'd won for the moment, kind of. We'd at least won concessions, but the battle wasn't over. So first of all, that commission of inquiry was supposed to report back within 8 months of January, but early in 2016 we heard that actually they were going to move the report back date by a year. I think it was 6 months at the time, but it ended up being about a year. And it very quickly became clear that the state was not making any changes to the way they were funding the system, or weren't making any changes to what they were doing, that actually we were going to reach another crisis in 2016. And that's exactly what happened. So in September 2016, the state, our Minister of Higher Education, made an announcement that the state would not be funding a freeze on tuition fee increases for the year 2017, and that they recommended that higher education institutions not increase funds by more than 8%, but that they wouldn't be, they wouldn't be funding a 0% fee increase again. Protests started again immediately. Unfortunately, the second year, in the first year, the protests went on for about a week and a half. The second year, they went on for 7 weeks at my institution. The state had been preparing through the year. They'd kind of sent in sort of state intelligence to infiltrate the movements. There were a lot of agents provocateurs and spies on campuses. When the protest started, there was a heavy police presence on most institutions. So these are the police marching into my university, University of Witwatersrand. There were significant clashes between students and police and university private security, high levels of violence. Although the protests went on for a very long time, and students fought really hard, eventually the protests fizzled out, just because of the level of state repression of student protests. So that was 2016 was hard, it was rough, students got blixened, and we didn't come out with any obvious victories in the same way that we did in the first year. But like I said, we did actually win free education earlier this year, so at least free education for 90% of South African households. So how did we get from that to having that victory? And the truth is, I'd like to say that we stormed the union buildings and forced the victory, but the truth is it was more complicated. And other politics sort of took over a little bit. We had a South African National Congress, I mentioned earlier, is the ruling party. It had a big leadership battle. It had its sort of 4 or 5 year electoral cycle, where the new president of the party would be elected. And our incumbent president was fighting a significant battle to hold on to his position. Or in fact, he wasn't holding on to the position, but his faction were holding on to the position. But unfortunately, they lost that leadership battle. And so we now have a new president. He was ousted at the beginning of the year. But as a last-ditch attempt to kind of gain support in that kind of electoral battle, he made a promise of free education in an attempt to win youth support for his faction. It wasn't successful. He still lost out, but it was then very difficult for our current president to sort of walk back on that promise. And as a consequence, we won free education for 90% of South African households. So that's essentially the story of what happened in Fees Must Fall. And the last thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is just a bit about the organization of how did we actually organize this thing? What did we do day to day? I think it was quite a thing for us to go from where we were in like beginning of 2015 to where we were at the beginning of this year. South African universities had a reputation for being very apolitical, very depoliticized spaces. We've gone to a position now where they have a reputation for being extremely political and extremely politicized spaces. And so it was no mean feat to get to where we have gotten. I think for me the greatest strength of the protests was the levels of organization, at least at my institution. Let me be more specific. Fees Must Fall was never organized centrally at a national level. So the protests started at my institution, they spread to all kinds of other institutions, but they were only ever organized at their specific institutions. So that was both a great strength, because it allowed students to focus on whatever the particular issues at their particular institutions were. So for example, at my institution, it was fees, obviously, but also outsourcing was a big issue. Whereas at somewhere like the University of Cape Town, decolonizing of curricula was a much bigger issue. So that kind of very disparate, very decentralized organization was valuable because it allowed people to mobilize around local issues. But it became a real hindrance in the second year when we couldn't kind of organize nationally around centralized set of demands. So I'm going to talk here a little bit about what we did at my institution, just because it's what I'm most familiar with, and also because things were very different in different parts of the country. But the way that protests were organized was you had a kind of small leadership core, initially based around the SRC, so the Student Representative Council, but in partnership with leaders from other political formations on campus. So that had two advantages. The one is you had an SRC presence there, so you had like an institutional elected body that was involved in the protest, which gave it some legitimacy and meant that there was an obvious body to negotiate with when it came to time to negotiate with the state. But because you had representative leadership from other political bodies, the movement was somewhat not apolitical, it was somewhat apartisan. So there wasn't an obvious partisan slant. It wasn't sort of this party against that party, or this party pushing the protest against the state. There was sort of a kind of common agreement among students despite their sort of various partisan differences. So that was a real strength of that structure. The next thing was that there was a constant process of consultation with students through mass meetings. So you had a kind of smallish leadership group, but at the end of every day of protests, and sometimes more than once a day, we would have a big mass meeting where everybody would meet together, and we would discuss. Now that had, again, its advantages and its disadvantages. The advantages are you had some kind of democratic process. It meant that that leadership group were somewhat accountable to students. And that was very important, particularly in the first year. Again, in the second year, things got more complicated. It was much more contested. Mass meetings lend themselves to being kind of run by the people who can shout loudest, not necessarily what is the most sort of popular opinion. But it gave an important connection between the leadership group and the kind of general feeling among students. And again, added legitimacy because you had an obvious democratic process. But I think the greatest strength, and why the protests at my institution in particular worked so well and so effectively for so long, was that they were run with a sort of a task team system, where all the various functions of the protests were kind of identified and compartmentalized. So instead of having everybody doing everything, you had small groups of students volunteering to do particular sets of tasks. So you had a group of students who were mobilizing. You had a mobilization task team who would go and organize students. They would knock on doors. They would get people out every day. They would get people to the barricades. They would get people out and protesting. That was hugely important. You had a logistics task team. So this was in midsummer. We were protesting all day, every day. We had to eat and drink. We had a logistics task team that organized food for people, brought water around to all the protesters. And that was hugely important, firstly for morale, but also it actually allowed us to do what we were doing. We had a media task team. I headed that up in the first year at my institution, organizing opinion editorials, running interviews, making sure that we were playing a role in shifting the public narrative. And I think we actually played, well, I'm biased, but I like to think that we played a reasonably important role in shifting the public narrative in favor of fees must fall. So in those first 3 days when the protests were at my institution, the daily newspapers had all come out very obviously in opposition to the protests. But after sort of a weekend of really kind of building connections with media, organizing interviews, writing opinion editorials, the Sunday newspapers came out and supported us. And that really helped shift the public narrative. So that was an important thing. The social media task team played an immense role. Firstly, they kind of were a big part of mobilization. You were connecting with students. You were allowing students to know what was happening. It allowed us to get the word out about what was going on. It allowed students to know what was happening where, and it played a huge role in allowing the protests to go nationally, because students from around the country were following what was happening at Wits. They got a sense of what we were doing, how we were organizing, and it allowed it to spread in a much more significant way than I think it otherwise would have been able to. We had a research task team that was much more important in the second year. Where, again, like I said, the state made very little progress on solutions to the problem. So in the second year, we decided that actually, if the state wasn't going to come up with solutions, we were going to do it ourselves. And so we put together a team of sort of students and academics that then worked on putting together models for free education. So I was the kind of main economics contributor on that, and some of the recommendations of some of the models we proposed were actually taken up in the policies that have now been implemented. So that, particularly in the second year, played a not insignificant role. In the first year, we had a big donations task team. They set up a bank account for donations to the protests. They organized, people were donating food, things like toilet paper. These things are important when you're sort of holding down an institution. They were hugely organized. They had inventories. We had lecture theatres where people were collecting and organizing and inventorying things. That was hugely important. We had meals organized for everybody in the evenings, which was incredible. Kind of people volunteered to make these huge sort of pots of food, which was incredible for morale and really kept people going. We had a first aid task team that was particularly important in the second year when there were very significant levels of violence and violent clashes between students and police and private security. And there were a whole host of other ones. Often they would kind of be contingent, come together very quickly to deal with particular issues. But yeah, so that organization was incredibly important, and I think gets missed in a lot of the analyses of what the protests were and how they happened. And I think I've chatted with a couple of people here in Denmark about kind of attempts at shutdowns and things. Yeah, and I've chatted a lot with people previously about how protests have happened in other countries. And I think these are things that were incredibly valuable for us and could probably be valuable in other contexts as well. Yeah, anyway, so that's my presentation. That was Fees Must Fall, where it came from, how it happened, and a little bit of a taste of what went into actually organizing it. Yeah, thank you very much.